And I'm excited about this stuff.
Yeah, I'm really excited. Basically, the thought that came to my mind was there's definitely conversations people want to have. Everybody has a conversation they want to have or a topic they're really into,
Mhm.
but maybe not always get to have a conversation about. And I'm really curious to learn about things and to know about people. So I was like, why not just do this? And of course, the element of what is it going to be? So what is the topic, John? What's on your mind today?
Mine's obvious, though.
Oh, that's totally fine. I said it doesn't have to be a surprise.
It's Myers-Briggs.
Aha, yes. Oh, that's fantastic. How did you get started with Myers-Briggs? That's what I want to know. Like I know you've been interested in it for a while, but how did it even start?
Honestly, I don't remember anymore. I
It's
think
been that
that
long.
I think that I can still remember the first time I realized I don't remember anymore. Sometime in college, when people ask me the same question.
So it's been longer than college.
It's been probably longer than high school, actually. I think that I found it multiple times, but the thing is, I happen to be very credulous about it being like a meaningful thing and not a frivolous test. So I'm pretty sure that I took the quiz or like read something about it when I was very young, probably no later than middle school. But it's not like I thought anything of it at the time. But I gradually developed my own theories about how people's personalities work. And then at
Hmm.
some point, when I read some Myers-Briggs content, not just taking the test, but some of the underlying treatises and theory and content, it really resonated
Hmm.
with me. And from there, it was probably like at least a 10-year process of just testing things and demonstrating to myself that this is something that I actually believe in and what the I already know the details of that.
Would you say you've arrived at a place where you have a very custom self-built framework around Myers-Briggs? Or it's like if I picked up a book or read the Wikipedia page, how different is my understanding from your understanding?
No, I think that I've arrived at everything in my own way, but I basically am in a total agreement with what the standard version of it is. It's just that my concern would be even if you do read some content on it, you wouldn't actually be reading the important aspects of it.
All right, that's why you're here, right, John? So let's say I'm a layman, no idea, never even heard the two dudes, Myers and Briggs, or gals, I don't know. So what? How do you tell? How do you explain it to me?
Well, there's a history to it, which I actually don't think is super important
Hmm.
because it's not like a philosophical belief that exists in a time and place, like like Kant or something like that.
Sure.
It, it's something that I just think is an accurate description of how human personality works.
Hmm.
And but I do know something about it. I think that it was developed by these people Myers and Briggs. One of them was I think the mother of a girl who just married
Hmm.
off into some other guy who had a personality that they found very intriguing how like different he was, and then they started like
Hmm.
reading Carl Jung and like I don't know, probably Sigmund Freud and stuff like that, and then they spent 20 years developing this theory and then popularizing
Oh,
it.
wow.
And to this day the test itself and like the brand name Myers-Briggs has been maintained by this Myers-Briggs organization, which I don't really have anything to do with. I don't actually think that. I mean, for them, it's a test that they sell, and they could care less about the underlying theory. And that's kind of
Ah.
the issue with a lot of how it's popularized. Basically, the Myers-Briggs that most people interact with is tests that you would take maybe in a work setting or just for fun in a personal setting, and it gives you one of
Hmm.
16 different descriptions, and then you say, oh, how accurate. And like it's interesting that people think differently, and we should always keep that in mind when we do A, B, or C.
Hmm.
The thing about that is actually all of that is fine, and it's not too different from what the field of psychology or sort of this type of survey based psychology is like today. It's not really particularly trying to develop a model of how minds work, and a
Hmm.
lot of people would almost eschew the notion that such a thing might even be possible. There's This is not something they're interested in. They are basically doing something that is often called like the psychology of the acquaintance, which is
What does that mean?
it basically means if I don't know someone very well and I just like develop these sort of surface level understandings, like, oh, you're outgoing or you're shy or
Mm.
you seem very emotional. It's not like an extremely deep understanding, but it is the type of thing that is very observable to the eye, or people filling out survey questions. People like generally can answer, are you outgoing or not? But people are not as good at answering questions like, are you more sympathetic or are you more empathetic?
I see what you mean. So people are more able to reason about their behavior as opposed to some underlying dimensions or framework or something.
That's right. Sort of like the what and not the why. And
Okay.
Psychologists like to make a big show about how scientific they are. The science there is relatively simple, though. It amounts to sort of statistical reliability tests, that there may be some trait that I ask you questions about, then I wait a year and do it again, and I get the same answer, and that's sort of saying like, oh, there's something to this, but it's not scientific in the sense that physics is scientific, of like proposing an explanation for that, and like based on that model, making additional predictions, testing those predictions, or none of that really applies to this. And
so it seems very one-off, right? You basically do a study and you say, okay, yeah, this works, as opposed to a continuous refinement of your understanding of the world.
Yeah, I don't think that it's interesting. The average person that you meet in the world is very skeptical of the notion that like, oh, you can't model me. Humans are not so simple, and there's not just 16 types and various other things. I would expect scientists not to have share the same feeling as those lay people, and to at least try to do that. And it's not the case. And the people who used to try to do that type of psychology and science were people like Freud and Jung over 100 years ago, I guess. And today's psychology profession tries as hard as it can to distance itself from those people, in some ways rightfully so, because those people were not really doing science. They were doing observational things. They had actual clients, and they would witness their behavior, and they would notice things, and they would write essays. But somehow in distancing ourselves from that, we've got into the basis level of science, of t-tests and things like that, and correlations. Even interest in causal understanding of people's psychology is like largely ignored in my view. But I guess what we're not getting to yet is specifically Myers-Briggs, right?
So you keep saying 16, right? You keep saying there's 16 dimensions or sort of like aspects that can describe a person. What are some of these?
The main thing that Myers-Briggs concerns itself with are the cognitive functions that you tend to rely on throughout your day-to-day life. Generally, it focuses on 4 cognitive functions, which are thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensing.
Okay.
The really simplest version of the model says that there's 2 types of things that our brains do, our conscious brains, not our unconscious brains. One is perceive, and the other is judge. And it says that there's essentially 2 general types of perception that are distinct from each other that we focus on, which are intuition and sensing. Sensing is sort of the use of our senses to interact with the world. It sounds very straightforward, but it includes very advanced things like, how do I look at a chair and know that that's a chair? It also generally deals with things that are observations and facts and sensory realities and things like that. Intuition is actually very, very similar. It's also our brain perceiving the world, in some cases spatially, except that it deals with the space of concepts and ideas and how those things relate to each other. So one thing that I like to think about, which I think is very interesting, is if you're dealing with a complicated mental problem, someone may have some intuition about it where they're kind of sizing up the problem and saying, hey, I think there's a gap there, and I know where to look to find that gap, and here's my observation about this idea of yours. And people may be very impressed by that. They consider it kind of like a work of genius, but people are not impressed by the fact that like I can identify a chair as being a chair. In some ways, they're very similar type of observation. It just deals with something that we're more used to dealing with. And both sensing and intuition can be very, very advanced. So like the like more brilliant form of intuition might be seeing some subtle nuance of a conceptual situation, or of a scientific or mathematical problem. And equivalently in the sensing world, it might be coming up with the perfect description for something that you see. So I think that like, this is totally an aside. If you saw a sailboat that was sailing on the ocean, then you might like at a basics level say, oh, there's a sailboat and it has a red sail. Or you might say that the sails are billowing like as if they were a pillow at night or something. And you can imagine an observation like that being like super apropos, just trying to like shed light on how like both of them potentially can do amazing things in terms of perception.
Gotcha.
Then there's also two judgment functions. So we take in information and we notice things about the stuff that we see, and then we also have to organize that and reach conclusions. And Myers-Briggs divides it into thinking and feeling. Thinking, of course, being typically logical deduction or analysis. Feeling, there's a lot to say about feeling, but when we think of it as a judgment function, I like to just describe it as a way of reaching conclusions on things based on how subjectively they seem similar to experiences that we've observed in the past, and whether those prior experiences were subjectively good or bad, or very subjective qualities of it. I think that is like a overly mechanical but actually reasonable description of what feeling is. At a high level, Myers-Briggs is interested in how people differently rely on intuition, sensing, thinking, and feeling. The really important part of Myers-Briggs, which originally does come from some writings by Jung, is that beyond just having thinking, feeling, and so on, there's a notion as having inward or an outward version of a cognitive function. This is already getting into the realm where it's very difficult to explain, but let's just pick one example. So
sure.
Let's pick thinking first. An example of inward or introverted thinking might be, think of like really zoning out to think and building up an entire analysis or a bottom-up view and framework for the world as a whole, and totally solving some problem, committing that logical pathway to memory and things like that.
Okay.
But this is something that the sensation is that you would be inwardly focused while you're engaging in this. Whereas extroverted thinking is something where you're also thinking, but you would not have the sensation of like zoning out or like looking within yourself. It would be something that's almost like directly operating on the outside world. And you will hear sometimes people say, oh, I really need to talk out loud to think, or I write stuff down to think. And that's related to this. And you also tend to associate extroverted thinking more with deductions, kind of like leaping to something like, well, A implies B, B implies C, A implies C. Okay, I'm going to go do A. So less of a like large bottom-up framework, which I kind of think of it as difference between analysis and deduction. I'll take one other example. So let's just take feeling as an example.
Okay.
I like to say that people who are inward feelers are more empathetic, and people who are outward feelers are more sympathetic. If you are an outward feeler, then you may be very apt at picking up and just sort of generally understanding the feelings of others, and especially of communities and cultures. Although objective is a strange word to use when describing feeling, it actually is a more objective form of feeling, where you have in some ways less partiality to your own experience, and it's more like a comprehension of the feelings around you, and like sort of a wish to engage in those things. People who are inward feelers are extremely empathetic, and you'll hear sometimes people who are this way say that they maybe share in the feelings of others. So someone else is sad, that makes me sad. That's true, but it's not entirely the right way to think about it. The right way to think about it is that inward feelers view emotion and feelings in as much as it pertains to their frameworks that they've built up internally, just as inward thinkers build up large frameworks of analysis and understanding of how the world works. So an inward feeler might have experiences, and then they might even be consciously aware of the process of sort of organizing these feelings inside themselves, committing certain things to memory, valuing some of those very much. And then when someone else has feelings, it's not so much that you're sharing their feelings, it's that you're viewing them in relation to your own feelings and your own experiences. And then for that reason, you are actually being influenced by that feeling as well.
So that's counterintuitive to me. Like being empathetic almost means you're more inward looking, even though the word seems to imply that you are concerned for others' emotions.
Well, words. Um, I'm not sure that empathetic and sympathetic exactly like summarize these two different things, but I think it's pretty close. I mean,
Okay.
all I'm saying is I think empathetic people are more. It's a little bit more personal and subjective, and there's a little bit more of a deeper inward experience rather than just a sort of general engagement in feelings.
So empathy has to do more with engaging with your internal system and framework of how you look at emotions and feelings, as opposed to looking at something that's happening outside.
So in general, inward functions can be easier to identify if you know how to ask the right questions because they're very associated with memory. If you ever hear somebody say like, oh, and I've heard a lot of people say this, like that they almost feel as if they take emotional snapshots of things when they go out. Like, hold on a second, I really want to like remember this feeling or something like that. That would be like
Yes.
a very strong indicator that someone is an inward feeler.
Okay.
Similarly, for example, I'm very conscious of the fact that when I am zoning out or when I'm inwardly focused, I'm very much relying on my thinking function. If you can understand, if someone can communicate to me what the feeling of committing things to memory is like for them or what the sensation is, I can often draw conclusions about what their type is. Sensing and intuition are a little bit harder to explain in this context, but it's also the same thing. People who are introverted sensors tend to have like very strong memories of motions or places or like even internal recordings of events, and to be able to refer to those and play them back, do them in their head as they're zoning out and things like that. And also to have like a very strong reference point for the past and how things have been done in the past and things like that. Whereas extroverted sensors are the ones who are, their eyes are darting all around the room and they're like, actively seeking out new and different sort of sensory experiences and things like that.
John, I have a question at this point. Let's say somebody takes your test or gets a label. This is your Myers-Briggs type. Is that static? Like how static is that? People change. How dominated is my behavior by my type?
So let's talk about tests first of all. The way the letters that you get assigned in the test work, and indeed the way the tests work, is they ask you about the elements of these things that are part of that psychology of the acquaintance that are visible to an acquaintance. So like notice none of the things we've been talking about so far are as trivial as are you an extrovert or not. And certainly not the way I think about Myers-Briggs, but you can't really ask people to answer questions about are you an introvert or an extroverted feeler. So the things that have found their way into being the letters in the Myers-Briggs type are 4 attributes that an outsider could sort of just maybe tell looking at you that it might be easy for you to nominate in some way, that then map back to, in some special way, what your actual type is. So for example, whether you are extroverted or introverted, an E or an I in the Myers-Briggs type, is really saying out of all of your functions, one of them is the most dominant. Is that function an outward looking or an inward looking function? Thinking versus feeling is saying, is your thinking function or your feeling function ranked higher relative to the other? And the same applies for intuition and sensing. And then the judgment perceiving, the last letter is whether you're J versus P, is actually probably the most misunderstood. It doesn't really mean whether you're more judgmental or not. And it actually doesn't even mean whether your top function is a judgment function, i.e. thinking or feeling, or not. What it actually means is whether your dominant extroverted outward expressed function is a judgment function or a perception function. The reason why there's only 16 types, and really the second major claim of Myers-Briggs, is that there are only a set number of patterns that people have with regards to how they express these functions at different levels.
Okay.
In my case, my dominant function is intuition, and it's extroverted intuition, which essentially I'm largely using it now. That already implies a lot of things. It already implies that my second and third function have to be the 2 judgment functions, thinking or feeling in some order. And it implies that my last function has to not only be the other perception function, which is sensing, also has to be the other, I guess, polarity. So my fourth function and last function is introverted sensing. Given that, there's actually now only 2 types that I could be. I happen to be an ENTP, which means that my section function is introverted thinking rather than introverted feeling. And then my third function is extroverted feeling. So I can't in any like short time period or really at all without you experiencing for yourself prove that there should be only these 16 types and that these constraints are applicable.
Mhm.
But it does hint at why it's not just like a totally arbitrary and fragile distinction. Like, at least if you believe that, then you would also see that, like if I take a test and it said, oh, I'm 50-50 on thinking and feeling, if I just answered one question the other way, I would have been a feeler, not a thinker. It's kind of like an irrelevant fact. One test is like a test. It's that's a different thing from what your actual type is. They're really not that accurate. But also because an ENFP is not just an ENTP who's sort of become overnight a little bit more feeling. It's actually an extremely different type, which uses extroverted thinking and introverted feeling instead of introverted thinking and extroverted feeling.
Okay.
And to someone like me who spent so much time observing these things, the differences between someone who uses introverted versus extroverted thinking, introverted versus extroverted feeling are actually significantly larger and more noticeable to me than the superficial differences of whether someone seems to be nice or seems to be outgoing, things like that.
So what you're telling me is changing, let's say, one letter does not imply that the person is going to be slightly different. They might be completely different.
That's right. And in fact, in certain ways, in ISFJ and ENTP, which are like opposite in all four letters, are more similar than ENTP and ENFP.
How's that?
Essentially, those two types have the exact same functions, but just expressed in the opposite order.
Oh, I see.
And polarity of every function, that is. An ISFJ on a certain day might seem exactly like an ENTP to me, but an ENFP would never seem exactly like an ENTP to me.
So do you just bucket people now? If you have this intuitive understanding and a framework and you've built it up over more than a decade?
Sometimes. I actually don't make much of an effort to label people because for a few reasons. One, it's something that you just will come to eventually if you spend enough time hanging out with someone. You don't need to like rush it and be wrong. But also, it's not extremely important necessarily to know what someone's type is. I use my knowledge of what Myers-Briggs says about how human personality should work as a way to help me understand people's behavior. But it's not as if it's immensely useful to know what someone's personality type is or very important. In fact, people assume that like, oh, Myers-Briggs, blah, blah, you're so into it. Okay, well, why is it useful? Is it going to help me find what job I want?
That was going to be my next question. Yeah.
And I think it can be useful. It can be very useful to help you understand yourself better and understand, why your relationships with certain people are a certain way and come to terms with a lot of things. I personally am not interested in it because it's useful. And if it was completely useless, I would be equally as interested in it. I'm interested in it because I think it's scientifically factual. And that happens to be a controversial opinion. I mean, I doubt that really very any people are super credulous about it. But I personally believe that not only is it within the confines of the things that has a say about, it doesn't purport to explain everything about human personality, but I believe that the theory is almost at least entirely correct. And eventually, when we have the necessary tools to do more proper analysis and science, that it will be a popular opinion someday.
Are there competing theories? Because as a layman, right, to me, Myers-Briggs sits in the land of like horoscopes. 12 types, 16 types, it's the same thing. Is it actually considered seriously? Like you're saying, there's a controversy. Is it in psychology books? How does the academic world treat it?
It's not something that really is. I don't think there's really any academics who are making an effort to prove Myers-Briggs. There might be a couple, but there isn't exactly an alternative. I think that in the same category, you have things like something called a Big Five test, which is really very, very similar to Myers-Briggs, except that it's not trying to be a model of personality at all. It's not trying to come with any explanations of how people tick. It's entirely based on, well, these are the five principal variables that we found statistically are the most stable over time and they're separable from each other. And that's the beginning and the end of it. I think that
more black box approach, just input, output, no like what is the internal structure of how these get mapped to personalities and such.
That's right. And actually, I mean, Big Five it's very, very similar to Myers-Briggs without any interest in any underlying explanation. So you can ask the question of why I am such a strong believer in it. I think that the basic level of it is seeing some patterns between different types. Like, oh, okay, like these two people are the same type and they seem really similar. That doesn't really amount to much. Like that, you don't need a theory for that. You just need to know that some people are similar to other people. The interesting part is when you can confirm things observationally about the theory. So, for example, I can use the powers of the acquaintance to say, hey, this person's obviously extroverted. And oh, he's not emotional at all. He's super logical. He's obviously a T. And oh, he's incredibly organized or whatever, he's probably a J. And then the model would then say, okay, well, given those things, he must be an extroverted thinker, not an introverted thinker.
Okay.
So
So it is predictive.
well, that would not be helpful unless you trusted yourself to also have the ability to distinguish introverted and extroverted thinkers, and you also have to trust yourself not to just be like completely tricking yourself or something like that. It makes non-obvious conclusions. For example, I believe that I'm very good at telling whether people are introverted or extroverted thinkers, introverted or extroverted feelers, and so on for all four functions. Now, there would be many combinations that would exist if all of those things were just arbitrary personality traits assigned at random. But in my personal experience through many years of observation, only the ones predicted by the Myers-Briggs theory do exist.
So basically, if there's a type of person out there, they are describable by Myers-Briggs.
Yes. And to get back to your question of whether people change, I don't believe that people's personality type ever changes. People
That is
do.
a strong statement.
It's not a strong statement, though, because when I say that, I mean people's Myers-Briggs personality type. It doesn't mean that their personalities never change. In fact, people's personalities do change drastically. One way that they change is that typically it's much harder to determine the type of someone in their 30s, 40s, and 50s than it is someone in their teens and 20s, because people have learned to cope with their weaknesses and dull their strengths, and they've also become much more balanced. Maybe they've sort of indulged their weaker third and fourth function over time and lost a little bit of interest, or at least have some reduced pride in their dominant function. And so that doesn't mean that their personality type has changed. It just means that they are strengthened at sort of consistently indulging all of the parts of your brain that you really need to indulge in order to be a healthy person. On the inside, I think you would find that still like a lot of things haven't changed. There's some kind of space that you're just sort of generally living in your conscious mind, which is the executive function for everything else. And that's still largely your dominant function. And your primary secondary tool that supports that is still going to be the second one. A lot of times people's hidden desires actually come from the third and fourth functions, just because.
Oh, say more about that. What do you mean?
I think that the dominant function is a thing that you use all the time, and it's sort of ultimately in charge of making the decisions. It's basically going to win arguments. People's this is all just anecdotal again, but people's second function becomes a little bit like a tool, a little bit like a workhorse, and then sometimes the third function is kind of like the thing that they really secretly like to indulge, is like a hidden desire. And then for many people, that even extends to the fourth function, where like you might later in life start developing hobbies that are actually using that type of. It's something that's completely new, and it's something that it feels good to actually let out and become more balanced. Although there's also many people who sort of never really get that far, I think.
I'm not gonna ask you about secret desires, but any hobbies you have developed which are like your fourth function, or what are like good examples?
I am really interested in things like interior design, which generally would be my weakest function. It's the introverted fencing. Something like going and shooting a basketball even is something where that's very much, well, both types of people like to shoot basketballs, but the sense in which I like to shoot a basketball is just that feeling of perfecting a single motion to the point of having it totally memorized. So those are examples where I'm really letting that fourth function develop and come out to play. Although even then, I think you would notice that I'm not doing those things in the way like a professional designer or basketball player would do them. My sort of creativity and off the wall intuition sort of stuff is always going to leak in. So I'm probably inventing silly like basketball games instead of just like, doing normal practice. And I'm probably trying to innovate when I do interior design, even though I have no business doing that.
So would you say then it's a likely guess that the top athletes out there are introverted sensors as their dominant function?
Most athletes are sensors rather than intuition dominant. It's not obviously because people who are sensors have more athletic potential, but it is because if you are a sensor, then that's more dominant than your intuition. It's going to be that much easier for you to focus for long periods of time on doing those types of tasks. I can go and work out in the gym, and if I had the ability to do that for 12 hours a day, every day, I could probably get pretty good as well. but
Okay.
I totally zone out and lose focus after just a couple hours. Whereas I can do a puzzle or a math problem for 12 hours in the day and be no less tired at the end. And that would be a hard task for some of those athletes. So most athletes are censored. They aren't, actually it depends on the sport. Like golfers might be like
Oh, really?
it depends on what's necessary for the sport. Introverted sensors in practice, just as a consequence of what that entails, are probably going to be better at really kind of getting a singular motion down pat and developing a skill set, whereas extroverted sensors might be better at in the moment just sort of like engaging with their senses at the time, maybe even doing new and different things. But
Okay.
generally in sports, I think you'll see equal amounts of both. And lots of sports people don't have sensing as their first function. It's very common to have sensing as your second function. And there's lots of ways, in that case, thinking or feeling would be your first function. And there's lots of ways that those functions are extremely advantageous as well if you're a professional athlete. But
So I guess this conversation actually segues me into thinking, does this mean like employers should start requiring your Myers-Briggs test and they should only give you the job? Like, I'm thinking dystopian, everybody only gets their type mapped to their job.
I'm actually extremely against that for a lot of reasons. One is that I doubt that companies would really draw the right conclusions about what Myers-Briggs type they would want. And in general, it's not really which Myers-Briggs type you want, but it's like taking someone's Myers-Briggs type as context. What do I know about them? You have to take that as one piece of the bigger picture. You wouldn't want someone who is like in principle the right Myers-Briggs type, but super imbalanced. And like you actually, I think, want people who are as balanced as possible most of the time when you're doing work.
What do you mean by balanced? Maybe that's an aside of like, but not related to Myers-Briggs. But what do you mean by balanced?
Well, for me personally, one of the most useful things about Myers-Briggs has been being able to dissect my own mind and when I have a thought or I have an opinion, I'm generally able to trace it back and even like go back and replay what my brain was doing and what all the steps in my conscious mind were and say, okay, that was a feeling. Now, if I go back even further, that feeling was based on these experiences. And then, okay, I had this chain of logical conclusions. I noticed that thing, and I'm able to sort of isolate and pin all of these things back to their original function. As part of this, you start, by nature of isolating it, you start to be able to like promote your weaker functions. And I'm actually a little bit compulsive about it in the sense that I don't like to make decisions that I'm not in full agreement on. Okay, I quickly had this intuition. Can I also prove it in a logical way? And does it feel right given my past experiences? Does it feel like that's going to be a successful course of action? And if any one of those things isn't true, I kind of insist on figuring out why there's a conflict and then resolving the conflict. In the steady state, your feelings and your thoughts should agree, just for one example. So people who are more balanced are, in general, more likely to be able to interact with lots of other people and different points of view. And they're also, I think, just more likely to be correct and more likely to be on point with any particular opinion or task. The other reason why companies shouldn't Myers-Briggs test is just that the tests are extremely unreliable. They're not really, I don't equate that to the underlying reality of it. And and to me, Myers-Briggs.
It's so interesting to me because I feel like you go back and forth between it is very concrete in your head, but it's not very concrete out there.
Yeah, that's true. There's been a lot of people in my life who got into Myers-Briggs through me. I find that there's very little I can or really should do to try to convince people of any of this because there is no reason why you should be convinced unless and until you can actually go out in the world and develop the ability to directly observe these things, directly be able to say, hey, that's introverted feeling right there and draw the line. Sometimes you can even get to the point where you can really see the wheels ticking in people's heads. So for example, I think the cognitive function that's the easiest for me to guess about people is introversion or extroversion. And usually I can tell that someone is introverted even as they're in the middle of being the loudest and most social person in the group, and vice versa, because it's just something about where the presence of their mind is, where you can be talking and you can still sort of perceive that they're centered just inside their forehead, not out in front of them. I mean, there's certain contexts where people are extroverted and certain contexts where people are introverted. I'm not extrovert at all if I'm doing small talk, and really if in most environments with people who are not like extremely conceptually focused, because I'm very much an extroverted intuition type of person. As someone who would not enjoy listening to this conversation, for example, I also am going to
Mm.
probably come across as one of the most introverted people in the room. And for that reason, a lot of people assume that I'm introverted, but I believe that
Yeah.
I am actually extremely extroverted.
I think this is a point where having these conversations is complicated unnecessarily by the English words and their English meanings, as opposed to specifically Myers-Briggs and what Myers-Briggs means.
That's true.
Maybe branding could use some
That's
work for
true.
Myers-Briggs.
Actually, very interesting language. It's interesting to see what words cultures have in various languages for some of these psychological things. For
Mm-hmm.
example, a lot of languages have different words for something like empathy and something like sympathy, which is
Mm.
interesting. That indicates that there is some kind of dichotomy there. And when you look at a lot of specialized trades, you'll look at mathematicians, and I think I can't remember exactly what it was, but I think that like Terence Tao has written that there's mathematicians who are sort of like theory builders and there's mathematicians who are like problem solvers, which I associate with sort of NTJs and NTPs, or that
Okay.
there's sort of like the Bertrand Russell mold of mathematicians versus like
Right.
the Descartes world view or something. Uh,
Sure.
in some cases there's actually like in localized areas people have picked up on these very interesting dichotomies that just like very hard to explain, and they've assigned words to it. And the reason why they're hard to explain is because you may meet someone and it may seem like we're essentially doing the same things and reaching the same conclusions, but when you get deep into it, you realize that fundamentally there's many, not just one or two, but many fundamental differences in how we're actually thinking and ticking on the inside that's resulting in those conclusions.
I see. I guess what I've gotten from the usefulness conversation is it's good to understand yourself. It can be potentially a good tool to see your own working. Because when you were describing your process of introspecting on your thought, it almost sounded like a just getting the answer to a math question versus looking at the working of the solution itself.
Yeah, I think that understanding yourself is, actually, it's not something I've thought a lot about. Like, how capable are you, for example, of really like introspecting on where something that you're thinking about has come from, or what exactly? Okay, you just said that. Why did you say that? Like, what were the steps involved where you're going from your brain doing nothing to eventually saying that sentence?
I guess it also depends on the context I'm in, right? Like if I'm having a conversation, 99% of why I said something is in direct response to something that just happened. Whereas if I'm just sitting thinking on my own and poop, a thought just pops into my head, I'm much less sure, of course, of why that just popped up. But if I knew that if I am an introverted thinker, it is more likely that it has something to do with my internal thought frameworks and I'm trying to just construct a new thought. And this is the first in a chain of like something I'm going to construct. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, except that part of what you just said is kind of like, oh, I'm inferring that I probably was using this because I know I was that, as opposed to the direct sensation of the experience of using something or something else.
Oh, I see. Is that always hidden behind the curtain? Do you see it? Do you see your working?
I think there's an element of I recognize the sensation of different types of thought.
Okay. So you've mapped it to something physical, like a feeling, like an actual, like a sensation of what it feels like to go through those steps.
Yeah, and the thing that I really think is useful, actually, in my job and in life, is the
Mm-hmm.
ability not to allow your functions, especially not your most dominant function, to just stand alone and do whatever it wants according to its whimsy, but to subject it to the
Mm.
analysis of another function. So, for
Okay.
example, I have a lot going on in my head, which is about what it feels like to have different types of thoughts. And I also have a lot of thoughts about my feelings.
Sure.
Yeah. I guess it's just a very interesting cross-examination. Yeah.
Yes. Let's say I do a test, right? Let's say I do your test. I get the 4 letters. I have a fairly good understanding of what my primary function is. How do I tactically? How do I train or bring in that second function? What does that look like?
Well, I wouldn't trust any test, including mine, number one. But there are a variety of websites on the internet where people talk about Myers-Briggs, and not all of them are good. But there are some where they'll show you your type, and then they'll also go into detail about some of the different functions that you might have, like here's your 4 functions, and they will actually have a paragraph on each one saying, here's what it might feel like for someone of this type as they're using this function. This is how that might manifest itself. I think that content in particular is like useful to read as a starting point.
Okay. I guess if you have some particular articles you want to share, I would love to read this, because every time I Google my type, a different article is the first result, and they're usually like those BuzzFeed style, hey,
Yeah.
you're just like Robert Downey Jr.
You know what? The whole celebrity typing thing is really, really not great. I have my own version of celebrity typing, which at one point was published on my website, but it's not now. And I think mine is pretty accurate. I'm sure it's not close to 100% accurate, but I believe that most of those online places where they claim to type celebrities are not only not accurate, they're actually wildly so. Like they may only be correct about 20% out of 10 of the celebrities they claim to type. Sometimes very wrong. People in general are not good at typing other people.
And you're saying that after having a lot of experience trying to wrestle with these things.
The main reason is that most people try to type people based on their behavior or based on like sort of visible actions. Oh, he did this. That's so clearly a staple of being this particular type. But that's especially questionable with celebrities, because like what celebrities do may be really related. But you have to be able to look a little bit deeper at what's actually going on in their head. And also you need to remove yourself and your own personal experiences from the equation, because
which might be hard given your own type.
One thing that is common is for people to mistype other people as being the same type as himself. That's actually one of the most common scenarios.
That somehow makes sense, that because you know that well, you know that type well, so maybe it resonates with you.
Yeah, like someone would do one or two things that reminds you of yourself, and then you'll just assume that that's the same type.
John, how do you, like, I feel like I keep coming back to the same question, which is like, how do regular people engage with Myers-Briggs, or do they just forget about it?
To me, the thing that I really would push for is trying to read about the cognitive functions. So there's essentially 8 of them for thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition, then times 2 for extroverted and introverted. Both in general, and also maybe in the context, if there's a type, you take a test, maybe this is my type, I don't know for sure, it's just an online test, then trying to read about those functions in the context of your particular type. But I think that is really the interesting part of the theory, and if you can develop some kind of grounding around that, that will put you on a path to hopefully noticing some of it out there in the world, and then making your own judgment about it. Yeah, I'm not really in favor of doing anything with Myers-Briggs that doesn't start from that, which again is really the part of it that is interesting. The part of it which just says, oh, you're an extrovert, you're a thinker, it's not that it's uninteresting, but if that is the only part you care about, you might as well use something like the Big Five.
And to me, it also has hints of mindfulness, just like knowing and looking at your brain as it's doing its thing. But Myers-Briggs gives you more of a framework than just look at it like you do in meditation.
Yeah. Mindfulness is so interesting, because what I really value is not mindfulness, but comprehension.
What does that mean?
So if you do yoga or something like that, it's not really super important that you get to the bottom of why you have insecurities or why you have anxieties. It's a series of strategies for dealing with them at a black box level, like focus on your breathing. Oh, now you'll see that your brain is just calming yourself down. But those things are just not satisfying to me. I really need to dig to the bottom of things.
And would you say that aspect of you is part of your Myers-Briggs type, to be a little meta?
Yeah, it definitely is. People who have my type are often doing these kinds of things with these kinds of theories. And when people do that, especially people who are sort of like loosey-goosey, jumping to conclusions and not very rigorous, they're going to be wrong all the time. So I see other people who have my type potentially preaching about arbitrary things that are clearly wrong to me. And then obviously like I'm doing the exact same thing. And there's really not much of a reason why anyone would distinguish me from everybody else, which which is like reasonable. I think that's true. I don't think that I've said anything that could really be taken as proof or even evidence of anything. But hopefully it just provides a flavor of a mechanism for like at least convincing you that like it's conceivably a reasonably stated hypothesis that such a thing might be the case.
It is very conceivable to me. And the reason for that is none of the language and none of the frameworks you've used are in some sense fantastical. Like it is very obvious, not obvious, but it is sensible to me that the way people notice the outside world and the way people notice the inside internal world will have a big impact on their personality and how they process information. So in that sense, the structure makes sense.
Yeah. And then the only way that you can get an opinion beyond that is not going to come from me. It has to come from your own observation. And someday, I hope, maybe in my lifetime, it'll be within the realm of science to actually prove some of this stuff. You could actually prove the theory today because of the...
Oh,
I mentioned some things about like, hey, okay, great. We asked you some survey questions and you said you're extroverted, and that seemed to hold up over time. Now, Myers-Briggs would then say, oh, okay, you're extroverted, you were a judge and whatever, you must be an introverted thinker. If we could develop questions that would consistently get people answering whether they're an introverted, extroverted thinker, and then we could show that this mapping is real, that would be novel and interesting scientific information, which would essentially corroborate the Myers-Briggs theory. However, there really is no apparent way to ask those kinds of questions. So,
and is that because of a lack of good questions or a lack of truth in some sense that you need to know their true types?
It's a lack of it has mostly to do with a lack of people's ability to answer these questions. So I guess you can call that a lack of questions. But for example, one thing that might happen is I might describe to you extroverted versus introverted feeling. It's going to be very, very subtle. People, especially people who are not very strong in their feeling, are not really going to be able to distinguish them, or they'll misinterpret the explanation. They'll associate the extroverted feeling as the more feeling one. And they'll say, oh, I'm very feeling, so I'm extroverted feeling, or something like that. It's just very much not something that's part of that psychology of the acquaintance. But if we had the perfect question for those things, that is a thought experiment for how you could prove Myers-Briggs today. Another possible way would involve some kind of actual brain scanning, and you would have to, for example, there's been research into the introversion center of the brain. And one thing that people have commented on, I'm not an expert in this area, but people kind of use the introversion center of their brain where memories and things to refer to are stored is an interchangeable module with the part of the brain that interacts with the outside world. So you could almost go to one or go to the other, and the other parts of the brain still fire as before. That in itself is like in some ways consistent with what I was saying about Myers-Briggs. But again, our technology for this type of analysis it doesn't really get down to any type of low-level mechanism. It's just kind of like, oh, this 3-inch by 3-inch area of your brain turned bright, so we're doing something there. Now, Myers-Briggs, by the way, is not necessarily a super low-level thing. I think it has to do some different functions that you use. But, some people would say, well, you don't know anything about neurons, and there's like a billion, trillion, quadrillion neurons in the brain. How can you say it's simple? But that's sort of not exactly the point, right? Like I don't know anything about how neurons work or like underlying how the machinery all these things work are. But that doesn't mean there wouldn't be some sort of larger emergent behaviors that spin up, and those could be simple, and they could have equilibriums, and they could have a small reduced number of situations and cases and things like that.
Oh, that makes total sense to me. Like the original Pong game probably had thousands of transistors and whatnot and like a vacuum tube and whatnot. But I can play Pong without knowing all of that. I know exactly how the game works.
We were just talking about Pong the other day, I remember.
Oh, yeah. It's the simplicity of it that brought it to my mind again. So I guess, I think I have a very clear picture of how to engage with Myers-Briggs now. Like, okay, take some tests, maybe take them every now and then. Don't take the type too seriously. Read about what the individual letters mean. There's only 8 types. Read about what each of them means, and then try to maybe notice as you live your life, your own behavior, others' behavior, and how they correlate with this information.
Yeah, I would say good luck to everyone. And I try to make it as concise and not preachy as possible.
Oh, please stop, John. You basically undercut your own message at least 10 times, which is the mark of somebody you should trust. If somebody says, no, 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 this is not science, you're like, okay, I think you're not trying to lie to me or anything.
Oh, yeah, that you can definitely trust.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, John. This is fantastic. I'm so glad you were the first one to kick off this project. I think I have a name already. I think I'm going to probably call it Tell Me Something I Should Know. And I think this was like the first edition of that. And I'm so glad I learned. I've heard about Myers-Briggs from you many, many times. But I think this is the first instance where I can now go think about it on my own.
All right. Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paul.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John.
Okay, bye.
Bye.